And then, okay, let's go ahead and get started, and then you can take it from here.
Well, welcome everyone. This is I'm Brady Deaton, Chancellor Emeritus here at the University of Missouri, and really pleased to be with you with this conference on Within Reach, Zero Hunger, a conference really inspired by the efforts of our students, our undergraduate, graduate, and professional students, to insist on finding a way to work together in small groups across disciplines and across classifications on critical issues of society. And they chose to focus on world hunger and global poverty as critical issues that we ought to place as a priority. And so we've been examining the United Nations Strategic Development Goals, and in this case, what they believe is within reach is no poverty. The UN had set 2030, and many agencies working with them had set 2030 as a target date. We know that might not be possible given the problems that we're facing globally, but we also know that we have to make the effort and we have to find ways of doing it in the most expeditious manner if we cannot do it by 2030. So it's a very vibrant dialogue. And this session, this evening, a keynote address by former Secretary of Agriculture, Dan Glickman. I cannot be more excited. Dan Glickman spoke at a conference last year, and as I told him a moment ago, before we got started, everyone is still talking about it. It was very exciting, and I've had the good opportunity to work with Dan in a variety of capacities, and he's been an inspiring leader in public policy in our country today. And has done so many things that, in addition to being Secretary of Agriculture, that is just has the leadership of our nation really in rapt attention. And Dan, we're so pleased to have you with us. I'm going to turn to Holly Enowski, who's our conference coordinator and special assistant for this particular conference, and a founding member, actually, of the Deaton Scholars Program when we first started this program in 2016. And Holly will also comment by way of introduction of Secretary Glickman. Holly?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share a little bit about Dan Glickman. Many of you attended the conference last year, so this is not your first time seeing Dan on a screen near you. But as Brady said, he served as the United States Secretary of Agriculture from 1995 until 2001, prior to which he represented Kansas's 4th Congressional District in Congress for 18 years. And if you haven't heard, Kansas is doing much better than Missouri in basketball. He serves as a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, where he focuses on public health, national security, and economic policy issues. He also serves on the board of directors for several different groups, including the board of the Friends of the World Food Program, and is very involved and will have a lot of great nuggets of knowledge to share with all of you. So with that, Dan, we will turn it over to you.
Okay, well, Brady and Holly, thanks for welcoming me and for your really kind remarks, and especially for mentioning the University of Kansas, which tonight, and of course you have to root for Kansas because after all, it's right next to Missouri. But tonight is a great night for those people who like basketball. And remember, basketball was first played, I believe, competitively at the University of Kansas, and the gentleman Naismith invented the game. And they named the Basketball Hall of Fame after him, but he was the coach at the University of Kansas 100 years ago or whenever it was first invented. But we love Missouri too. My mother was born on the Missouri side of Kansas City, so I claim a little bit of fame in that direction. But anyway, thanks for having me. You have a wonderful program talking about a really important subject. And I thought maybe it's not going to be stream of consciousness tonight, but I want to talk to you a bit about both global and domestic issues involving hunger. And so as we look at the global side of the world, there are really, I'd say, 3 things that I want to talk about today: Ukraine, COVID, and inflation, because they all kind of relate to the problems of where we're seeing that. So when I was Agriculture Secretary, I had jurisdiction over federal farm programs, federal conservation programs, now much more involved in climate than it was when I was secretary, food safety, trade, and nutrition. But one of the things I learned was when it came to agriculture and food issues, we are a really interconnected world. And the oceans can't keep us separate from what's happening in Europe or China or Africa or anywhere else in the world. And the Ukraine crisis is probably the classic significant part of this. So as horrible as it's what's going on and what the Russians are frankly doing to the people of Ukraine, I think it's worthwhile taking a quick look at what is the impact on Ukraine on the rest of the world from a standpoint of food security, and hunger. So Ukraine's capacity to grow and ship food is jeopardized dramatically and worsens the problems of global hunger and risks ravaging third world countries with political and migration crises that will happen. So Ukraine and Russia together are responsible for about half the exports of wheat and related grains and about 70% of the exports of sunflower oil to Europe and to Africa. The big purchasers of grain from Ukraine are Egypt, Indonesia, Tunisia, the Philippines, Turkey, Ethiopia, Yemen, and Nigeria. Almost all of those countries are countries that are very brittle right now with drought and with food price spikes going up and with shortages in many parts of the world and to some degree famine. The drought in East Africa is worse than it's been in the last decade, and combined with the fact that people in that part of the world can't get grain reliably from the places they used to get it from. They didn't get it really from the United States or Canada. They got it from Ukraine and to some extent Russia. So we've had an impact on prices. We've had an impact on supply. To date, there has not been abject hunger in these other countries. The hunger that exists is really in Europe itself right now, especially in Ukraine and perhaps a little bit in Poland and Hungary and some of the countries in the area. So to cope with this, the UN has, of course, its World Food Program, which is the largest humanitarian organization in the world. And it's responsible for providing food and to some extent raw commodities, but mostly food to several hundred million people around the world who are hungry. But because of the lack of capacity to produce as much grain as we had in the past, and because of the price spikes, increase of about 50% in the price of wheat, corn, and soybeans over the last several weeks, the cost to the United Nations to buy and deliver this grain has gone up dramatically, which of course is further accelerating hunger and especially over the long term in that part of the world. Now, we don't know where this Russia or Ukraine situation is going to end up. It's not going to be good, whatever happens, but it will have a long-term impact on the ability to supply food to the most brittle and volatile parts of the world, North Africa, East Africa, parts of the Middle East particularly. And it's going to be difficult for the rest of the world to come up with supplies. We will do our best. The US is the largest contributor to the World Food Program, so a lot of us are working very hard to make sure that we provide adequate funding for that program. The private sector has been very involved, the food companies, chefs, restaurant industries, to try to feed people, particularly in Ukraine. There's a particular chef, Jose Andres, who's been doing this remarkable job of feeding millions of people, millions of meals in that part of the world. But this is a problem that existed before the Ukraine-Russia situation, that is shortages of grain, high prices, poverty, drought, climate change is significant, particularly in East Africa, where the rainfall patterns are changing rather dramatically. And all we can do right now in the short term is to get food to hungry people. In the longer term, there's probably some additional acreage under production that could go into producing particularly wheat and corn, although if we do too much of that, we'll tear up highly erodible land and will impact the environment negatively. And the United States, Canada, EU, and Australia have some additional reserves, but there is no international grain reserve. We can just get grain from. We do have a strategic petroleum reserve where we can provide more fuel in many cases, but there is no like magic reserve out there to help feed these hungry people. So we're going to take problems. You're going to hear from the NGO community, my friend David Beckman and others, about the problems that we had before Ukraine and Russia got into this battle, where the Russians are really brutalizing those people. But the combination of drought, lack of supply, and high prices is impacting that part of the world, but it's also impacting us as well. The price of corn and wheat has gone up in the United States about 50% in the last 3 or 4 months. And to some farmers, that's good news, but to consumers, it's not necessarily good news, because food and gasoline prices are the highest part of the inflation rate that we're seeing right now. And it also impacts the livestock industry, which relies about half the costs of feeding animals comes in corn and beans and other kind of feed grains. And so it's a real mixed bag. But in the days where the United States could think, well, we're separate from what's happening in the rest of the world, we can't be. So we got to do our best to provide the food through the World Food Program, to help the NGO community out there with resources that they need, to use all of what we can do as Americans and as Europeans as well, Canadians, Australians, to try to deal with this particular serious problem. So that's one issue, and we should talk about this because it exacerbates and accelerates all the other problems we've been having for several years right now. And with climate change becoming a bigger and bigger factor, the future doesn't necessarily look so good. Although I'll have some, it's not all bleak, I'll have some positive answers. So that's Ukraine. The second issue is inflation. So we are now seeing the highest rates of inflation since the early 1980s. And inflation is a killer to poor people. And it's a killer to people who are on a fixed income budget, and particularly a killer for people who live in the developing world, who do not have a lot of resources. Smallholder farmers who have to buy crop inputs are paying way more for that. And inflation is caused by many factors, but certainly high gasoline, energy prices, higher food prices. And there are a lot of reasons for it. And we've come out of the COVID pandemic, and there's a lot of demand out there, which is kind of pushing prices up. But inflation is a secondary part of this problem. And inflation is really a serious problem when it comes to poor people around the world. So we have a global need to try to deal and quell these inflationary pressures. And it's going to be tough for a while, particularly because the Russians are big suppliers of fossil fuels, particularly to the Europeans, but also to the North Africans and the East Africans as well. And so you can see how complicated all these factors are when they come together. And the third thing I would just mention is COVID. What we saw with COVID is that a pandemic affected everybody in the world. Ironically, the highest per capita deaths occurred in the United States and Brazil, not as much in the developing world, but they didn't have the medical infrastructure that we had. So we were able to also save a lot of lives. And COVID has also impacted the ability of people to have decent health care and to feed themselves. And we have discovered finally that public health issues ought to have the same kind of priority as, let's say, food security or national security. But the impact of COVID hasn't necessarily been fully felt to date, but it has a lot of impact on everything that I've been talking about, particularly in those countries I mentioned in the developing world. Now, if I might for a minute, I want to come back to the United States for a second, because again, as I mentioned, food prices, supply of food, healthy food, nutrition, these are issues that affect the world outside the United States, but they're issues that affect the United States very, very dramatically. We have somewhere between 40 and 50 million people who are on the SNAP program at any one time. And by the way, we should be very proud. The United States SNAP program is, without question, the leading food security program in the world. And so while there's some issues with it, it's bipartisan for the most part, and we have the support of farmers, ranchers, and the urban community working together to make that SNAP program work. But we also have other programs. But again, with 40 or 50 million Americans on SNAP, and with inflation pushing people, probably more and more people into the SNAP program because of higher gas prices, higher food prices, the Russia-Ukraine situation, we're not immune in the United States from these particular issues of adequate health care, and also how poverty is really the major factor in pushing people into these particular programs. And thank goodness we have these programs, the school meals programs, the women and infant children programs, there are the TFAP programs, both the US government and the private sector and the food banks do a tremendous job of helping people during these difficult times. Right now, the Congress is dealing with this issue as should we make school meals universal and free for everyone. Right now, there is a cost for higher income people that has been waived by our government for the time being. But, and I'm doing my best, as well as many others in the Congress, to ensure, I think that the school meals programs ought to be free for everybody. It's too complicated to try to get some people to pay and some people not to pay. And there's also, we differentiate people, which I don't like. Another issue, which I think it affects both global and domestic, has to do with nutrition. So I have felt, and others, that in all of our feeding programs, we don't emphasize prevention. And in our medical system, we don't emphasize prevention. We emphasize treating people when they're sick. And recently, the Rockefeller Foundation came out with a report. They said that a poor diet is the leading cause of early mortality in the United States and probably the world. I'll say it again. A poor diet is the leading cause. Why? Because what diseases do you get from a poor diet? You get type 2 diabetes, you get cancers, you get cardiovascular diseases, you get autoimmune diseases. And so that is something that has not been a key part of our feeding programs. We have tended to focus on getting enough food in the US, but not so much enough nutritious food in the US. We tend to focus on packaged foods that have high sodium content, high fat content. And we know that prevention, good prevention techniques, not only diet, but exercise and other factors, can in fact reduce the rate of disease, the cost of disease, and the mortality rate significantly. So one of the things I hope you'll look at is, and this is not just true in the United States, it's true in globally as well. And the processed foods, high fat foods, high sodium foods are really killers when it comes to long-term health. I know I have my own issues keeping my blood sugar down and watching my own diet. But these are factors that used to be for people my age only. And now we're finding people in their 30s and 40s getting type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And it's something that we really need to focus on. So when we look at our SNAP program, when we look at our school meals programs, we not only want to make sure there is enough money in those programs, but we want to make sure that the food that is served is quality and is nutritious. And I would tell you that one program we have called the WIC program, the Women, Infant, and Children program, is focused on nutritious food exclusively. And but a lot of our other programs, you know, they don't intend to serve bad food to people. But when you take all the pressures of the income problems, the poverty issues, no fewer two-parent families at home, the inability to cook at home anymore, the fast foods, all the marketing of foods. If you watch TV or social media, most foods that are marketed on TV are usually not highest nutritional value. You don't see blueberries and strawberries marketed on TV because there's no economic reason to do that. So I mention all of that because a healthy world requires not only enough food, and it requires people having enough income to buy food, but it also requires a focus on nutrition, which means is that the medical community, doctors, nurses, dietitians, nutritionists must be a part of the discussion of healthcare. And by and large, historically, they have not. And so I'm kind of a big advocate of the new food is medicine thinking, where we really think about our ingestion of food in the same way as we think about taking pharmaceuticals and keeping yourselves healthy. And so I thought, Brady and Holly, that I would mention that as well. And one final thing, which is I don't want to leave you all with a bleak assessment of the world, although globally it's not looking too hot right now. But we'll figure a way through this, hopefully. But we need to have an ample research budget. So the University of Missouri has, for years, and with Brady's leadership, has focused on research in food and agriculture and sustainable agriculture, and more into climate change now. And we need to ensure that we put enough money into federal and state and private sector research so they can deal with things like what kind of foods give you better nutrition? How do you improve soil health so that we can release less carbon into the atmosphere? How do we make plants more pest resistant, drought resistant, to deal with the ravages of climate change? How can we feed animals better so that they're eating healthier and they're not emitting the methane that comes from the animals are about 40% of the methane that's contributed to our atmosphere comes from animals, and the slightly bigger part comes from oil and gas. So research is needed in food and agriculture desperately to maintain our leadership in dealing with the climate, and dealing with hunger, and in dealing with related poverty as well. So I think, Brady and Holly, I've probably talked enough. As you can see, these issues excite me. One thing we have coming up, as some of you know, is there's a farm bill coming up in the next year or two, and it will address a lot of these issues. I must tell you that I think the United States has acted in a very positive, responsible way as it's come to the Ukraine-Russia situation. I applaud the Biden administration. I think for the most part, he's got bipartisan support in those things. And I would just end with this point. One of the things that we need to recognize is in America, we do better when we work together, and when Republicans and Democrats aren't trying to kill each other. And one of the great things about agriculture, as Brady knows, is that historically, it's been a pretty bipartisan area in the midst of everything else not so bipartisan. But this country has to get out of this polarization we're in, where we see our opposition as the enemy and not as the loyal opposition, so to speak. And agriculture and food security and hunger has generally adopted that as a model. We just need to sustain that and continue it. And with the people watching this show, I challenge you to keep that going in the future so we can be healthier, better fed, and so we don't have global and domestic poverty at the levels that we do right now. So right then I will stop, and I promise you I'm stopping right now and opening it up for any questions or comments that anybody may have.
Well, Secretary Glickman, thank you so much. That's a fabulous presentation and overview. I had actually wanted to ask you, maybe you can elaborate. You addressed the question I had in mind right at the end, and that was the divisiveness we have with these new challenges internationally. I caught a sense of real optimism on your part that we are going to be able to continue the bipartisan nature of food security, nutrition, and some of particularly the new thinking that is coming along on ways of linking in the health and nursing professions into the dialogue on health. We have some new avenues to perpetuate that bipartisan dialogue, I believe. So, but I'd appreciate any further.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, in the last, I don't want to tell you that things were always good in the good old days, because they weren't always so good in the good old days. I was in government in the good old days in the 70s and 80s, and they were good, but they weren't all good. So people sometimes are nostalgic and think, oh, I wish things were the way they used to be. And, that wasn't always good. I mean, civil rights, racial justice, all sorts of issues weren't always so good back then. But by and large, when it came to foreign policy and food policy and healthcare, we did tend to work together. And we had great leaders on both sides of the aisle working together, like Bob Dole and George McGovern. They had very different perspectives, but they worked together on issues affecting food and hunger and agriculture. And I see with the newer and younger members of Congress some positive trends of people who want to work in that way, but there is still a lot of ugliness in our politics today, and bullying and blaming, and it's very non-constructive. I have to tell you that we can't. No company could operate that way. You were president of a university. If your faculty were just trying to kill each other all the time, you'd have a terrible university. I mean, and you were a good politician, so you knew how to manage those faculty differences. And there were plenty, I'm sure, but still it wasn't destructive for the most part. And we've got to look at this in a much more constructive way. And then we can solve some of these problems, not miraculously, but with hard work.
Right. Ask that question. Next question.
Just a reminder to anyone listening in to please submit any questions that you have for Dan in the Q&A box. If you are looking at Zoom on a desktop, it is between the raise hand icon and the live transcript. If you put your question there, we'll all be able to see it. But we do have a question for you, Dan, about the Farm Bill. Could you give us some insight into some of the main issues that you think will be on the docket for discussion and things we should look out for?
Well, it's a good question, and I'm going to give you some areas. Again, it's too early but one area is conservation and climate related issues. So there's going to be a lot more in this Farm Bill about providing incentives and measures and perhaps funding to produce crops, letting less carbon into the atmosphere, and producing animals that are more environmentally constructive, so to speak. And I suspect that conservation and climate issues will be much bigger in this Farm Bill than in the past. And Secretary Vilsack has already taken the lead on some of these issues in terms of climate policy. They just announced $1 billion in federal funding for climate-related activities as part of USDA. So that's going to be bigger. The second thing is crop insurance and risk management. So when I was in Congress, we had crop insurance, but it really wasn't very good. Farmers often didn't use it. The premiums were too high. But now it's getting better, and more of the farm programs are in crop insurance and risk management, and less are in the traditional subsidies of just providing payments out there to farmers. But and one of the things that's really interesting is it used to be that the only crops you could get crop insurance on were wheat, corn, cotton, rice, and soybeans. Those were the row crops that had been grown forever, and feed grains as well. But now you can begin to buy crop insurance on fresh produce, vegetables, fruits, and you're seeing specialty crops of that type grown all over the country now. And they never used to be grown because you couldn't get a risk profile for those crops because they weren't covered for years. So those are healthier crops. It doesn't mean the other crops aren't healthy, but these are healthier crops. And so I think there's going to be a lot of work in the risk management, crop insurance area. And then I would mention civil rights. There's been a lot of issues over the years involving the USDA's role in perhaps not acting as progressively or positively on civil rights areas. That's going to be a big part of this Farm Bill. And then the food stamp program, the SNAP program, the the nutrition programs are a huge part of our farm bill. And most people think it's all farm related, but there's more money spent on the nutrition programs than there is spent on the traditional farm programs. And so I think some of the issues I raised in the nutrition programs, making school meals universal, looking at the nutritional value of what's served in the school meals programs, in the SNAP program. For example, a lot of sugar sweetened beverages are bought in the SNAP program, I mean, as we know, that doesn't necessarily contribute to good health. And it's too much sugar in your diet is a bad thing. And it's one of the leading reasons why the type 2 diabetes epidemic is so great. Should we look at our nutrition programs much more in the new context of nutrition rather than just in volume of food served? That's kind of an area that we'll talk about in our farm bill. And then forestry. So there's a huge part of the farm bill and the USDA budget relates to forestry. And how do we conserve our trees? How do we protect them against pest and disease and climate? That's will be a big part of the farm bill. And research. So I talked about research, and research is that kind of thing that you need. Sometimes you can't prove what it does, but you need it. Basic and applied research, which produces the vision for the future so that we can feed a hungry world sustainably and with less crop inputs and in a more modern way. So I see a lot of optimism in this new farm bill. And I see farmers growing wheat and corn, raising cattle, but also raising peaches and strawberries and tomatoes, and indoor agriculture is going to be a big part of the future of agriculture. We've had greenhouse agriculture, but it's been relatively small. There is no reason why you can't raise all sorts of fresh vegetables in Missouri, just as you can in California and Florida. It's probably going to be indoor rather than outdoor. So that's the Farm Bill offers all those kinds of opportunities, and particularly entrepreneurial opportunities. And I'm really excited about all of that.
Dan, we had a question also, wanted your assessment of how realistic it is to think about returning to an era of small farms and supporting them through local consumer base. The observation being that we've had this exponential increase in farmers markets around the country. And should we move away from corporate farming and move in the other direction?
It's almost like my answer is different strokes for different folks. Like I wasn't the founder, but I really helped facilitate the growth of the farmers markets movement when I was in Congress. And now we have thousands and thousands of farmers markets all over the country. And it's a great place where farmers can meet consumers face to face. And, it's got a great cultural appeal to it, as well as consumers can see how food is grown and raised. And it also allows people to buy products more locally than so it doesn't have to be shipped over big, long distances, which has a carbon effect and other kinds of things. So I think that's great. But I recognize that to feed 340 million people in this world, it's really darn hard to do that with farmers markets alone. I would like to tell you can, but the supply chain is just such that people want food when they want it, where they want it. They want it now, they want it. And so you need also large scale agriculture too. You can't do it with just small scale agriculture, but we can do a lot more to promote smaller scale agriculture than we've done in the past. There's no question. For example, in the meatpacking side of the world, it's pretty concentrated right now. You have 4 companies that basically control most of the protein market. I'm not sure how you deal with that, except to try to provide ways for new entrants to come into the marketplace and provide them financial incentives so that they can, set up more locally oriented facilities to sell products to consumers. So I think you're going to have a mix of the big and the small in the future.
I have a question. So last year, one of the things that I wrote down that you mentioned was advocating for a White House conference on food security. Has that happened? To my knowledge, it has not, but if it has, I'm wrong. If that has not happened, why do you think it hasn't happened? And what other initiatives or ideas would you propose to kind of move
Well,
forward?
you're kind of half right, Holly.
Yay!
It hasn't happened, but it looks like it's going to happen. It's going to be called a White House Conference on Nutrition and Hunger. And it's going to focus largely on what we can do to make people healthier, both in federal programs to try to promote the general health, to try to encourage farmers to grow healthy products, to try to encourage a research budget that helps farmers cope with climate, but do so in a constructive way from a conservation perspective. There's a lot we don't know about food. There is this old expression, French expression, you are what you eat. But if you ask people, even scientists, is this good for you? You ask 50 scientists and you'll get 50 different opinions. Some people say dairy is good for you, and some people say you shouldn't eat too much dairy when you get older. And some people say, protein is great, and some people say, no, you largely eat fresh fruits and vegetables. And then, processed foods, sugars, sodium, what does all this mean? Is food medicine? Can it help keep people alive for a lot longer? How do we protect farmers in this era of very volatile change as well? So those issues are being talked about in a new White House conference on nutrition and health. We had one in 1969, sponsored by Tufts University. And that conference was so impactful, it created all of our modern feeding programs, took place as a result of that conference. So this is kind of an update to that conference. And the folks in this room ought to be really monitor this, be really excited about it. It's too soon to tell exactly what it will be. There's a general feeling that it'll probably be in the fall. It will probably involve lots of stakeholders. And trick is to keep it relatively focused. So we're talking about hunger and nutrition largely. That's tough to do. And when you talk about agriculture, because everybody's got an opinion about what to do. I see the university world, land grant universities being very intimately involved. I've talked in depth with Peter McPherson, Brady knows him quite well, and he was the head of the Land Grant Association and non-land grant colleges. And the private sector, a lot of the companies are really doing remarkably good things in this area as well. But the government still is the one that's providing most of the funding for research. And so that's coming up. So you raised it, Holly, and I hope I gave you some optimistic views on it. Just watch your news and make sure that I'm not supposed to lobby, but make sure that your local elected representatives from a federal level support it as well.
I want to ask, we have a question that's been asked. You'll find this interesting because it's asked by a graduate student in the health affairs area. And your comments made her realize that for the first time, the kind of political conflict associated with food insecurity here in the United States. And the question is, what can we do as scholars to empower and educate the people about all sides of this question in order to create lasting change? What organizations currently address politics and food insecurity here in this country?
Well, there are a lot of people in the anti-hunger world. Feeding America, which operates all the food banks around America, several hundred. And there's an organization called FRAC, Food Research and Action Center, that's very involved in food policy, Share Our Strength, and Hunger Free America. So there are a lot of groups in the anti-hunger space that are working this issue. And they've been very successful in getting the Congress over the years to go along with adequate funding. We can always use more, but they've done a very good job. What we haven't seen, and this person who asked the question is in the health area, I gather, is we haven't seen much interest in the health and medicine area into what you eat, into the food world. I went for a physical a couple years ago, and my doctor, after he examined me and told me that my blood sugar was a little high, he had a bowl of Jolly Rancher candies right by the cash register because, you know, you had to give the credit card. And I said, what are you trying to do? Keep my blood sugar up so I can keep coming in? It's just a vicious circle. And, you know, he kind of smiled. But the point is that the medical profession, and again, writ large, it's not just doctors, it's nurses, nurse practitioners, nutritionists, all of the allied healthcare professions have a stake in our healthcare. And food is probably the biggest part of what keeps you healthy. And, you know, obviously there's sleep and there's exercise and, you know, other kinds of maybe spiritual things. But so I'd say the big challenge is to get people outside of traditional agriculture also engaged in the issues that we're talking about today. And then you see it globally. So when you have a problem with food insecurity, what happens? What happens usually is political instability, war, terrorism. It's just a constant thing, particularly you've seen it in Southeast Asia and the Middle East and North Africa. The conflict in Russia and Ukraine was not food related, but it could lead to something that's food related because, right, you know, half the farmers in Ukraine aren't planting their crops this year, you know, because they've left or right, because the tanks have run over them, that kind of thing. So, but going back, there are a lot of national anti-hunger organizations that are very engaged to try to make policy. So like we might have universal school meals, that's a policy issue. Or what roles do the states have in administering these programs? That's certainly a policy issue as well.
Dan, I have one final question from me, unless there's others burning here, and that is: do we need to take another look at some aspects of food reserve programs or land reserves? In other words, there's various components of food reserves. Is that something we ought to revisit?
You know, it's like it's crazy, but about 3 months ago, I went to my local synagogue, and the rabbi there, the sermon was on Joseph and the fact that he set up the initial grain reserves for the Pharaoh. And, you know, 6 years on, 1 year off. Then you put enough into the reserve system so that you take care of people during lean years. And we haven't had to do that in the United States because we have so much productive land, and we have it in oil. We have a strategic petroleum reserve in oil, but we carry over enough grain in our grain elevators and basically our agriculture system that we haven't had to do it. But what this thing in Ukraine and Russia shows us, Brady, is maybe we need some form of global food reserve. I don't know where it would be kept. I don't know how one would operate it. I don't know if it would just be grain or whether it might be perishables, because the problem with food is most of it is, well, the grains aren't as perishable, but they mold and they right, become problematic at times. But fresh produce becomes perishable unless it's processed and canned or something along those lines. But I think you raise a really interesting point. One of the outcomes of this crisis that we're in, the food crisis caused by Ukraine, but predated with shortages and particularly with climate change.
Right.
If we have pests and disease and drought on a repetitive basis, we're not going to have enough food in this world to feed people. So what do we do during the good years to protect ourselves against the lean years? I don't know. A reserve may be part of it. Certainly research is part of it. For example, how we grow crops maybe faster and use, you know, photosynthesis has been around for a long time. And there's a lot of discussion now with maybe we could speed up the growing of crops so that we could have 2 or 3 cycles of a crop as opposed to 1 or 2 during a year. And that's, of course, not every crop you can do that with. But I think you raise a really excellent question. Do we need some sort of global food reserve? Traditionally, farmers haven't liked that, right, because they see it as a depressing effect on price if you've got all this grain in some massive storage place. But I think that the world has changed. And so I think that the folks ought to think about that. And if you did it, how would you do it? And that's probably the big question.
I have a few questions. Um, One is that something that I hear a lot, especially back home, like when I'm talking to farmers, is kind of this conflict of that I don't think actually exists, but the conflict of kind of like supporting local food security initiatives and global food security initiatives. Like, why aren't we supporting people here and sending food or money elsewhere? And the opposite, why are we sending money here when there's problems going on elsewhere in the world? How do you navigate that and kind of show the value in both equally?
Well, first of all, we can do both and we should do both. Okay. And like I said, we have the most developed food security program in the world for the poor, and that's the SNAP, or the food stamp program. And we spend billions on it, and we ought to be proud that we do that. And most people who are on it need it, don't want to be on it forever. They're families with small children, and they move in and out of the program based upon the economics of the time. These are counter-cyclical programs. And I think it's wonderful that we have that program and school meals programs. I mean, the rest of the world doesn't do that. And, here we have a capitalist society, and we actually have a more engaged set of government programs involving food than any place else in the world. That's good. And, we also grow enough that we can both sell and donate a lot of food overseas. For every 3 bushels of corn or wheat we produce, we consume 2 bushels domestically. So those figures are not exact, but they're close enough. So we either sell it or help people who need it. So we do sell a lot of agriculture products overseas. But if folks are hungry, I think it's part of our American moral character to want to help people who are hurting. And it's terrible to say there's a nice thing about this Ukraine situation. Nothing about it is nice. But when you watch these American chefs going over there and getting food donated from American companies and from the US government and feeding hungry people, that's the right thing to do. Sometimes our foreign aid doesn't necessarily go to places that always help people. But in this case, food really, by and large, is given for the right reasons, and it's needed. So I think you can do both. And politically, too, farmers have been great supporters of our food programs, and a lot of our anti-hunger people have also been supporters of our farm programs. And so there's been a nice political coalition there over the years.
I have one more question for me, and then audience, if anyone has any final questions, we're coming up on our time here, but please put them in the Q&A box, and Dr. Deaton and I will be sure to ask. If you don't ask, we can't ask it for you. So my last question is going off of, you kind of mentioned how like political all this is and how divisive our country is on a lot of different topics. Selfishly, as someone who is interested in potentially public policy or public service, law school, we don't really know, but something in that avenue of the world, how do we navigate that? How do we navigate when everyone's kind of at each other's throats and everything's a problem?
If I had the exact answer to the question, Brady, I'd be the most famous, maybe not the richest, but the most famous. But I would say a couple of things. It's not all bad. Okay, there's a lot of good people doing great things in the political world, at local levels, at state levels, at the nonprofit level, in influencing policy. Yeah, there are a lot of bad actors too, although they get a lot of the attention. And quite frankly, social media has been a vehicle by which they've been able to get their message out with great rapidity and intensity, and it can be very, very disturbing. And we have seen the diminution of local newspapers, which really troubles me. Local newspapers were great sources of our democracy. And we don't have, they've been folded up, bought, consolidated. Even the big papers are really small anymore, with a few exceptions. But I still think that that you can have an influence, a positive influence in government. And it doesn't have to be an elected office, although it can be. We need good people, and younger people especially, in elected office. I'm a big fan of President Biden. I think he's doing a great job. I'm a big fan of a lot of people in Congress, but gee, they're getting older. I mean, it's not as if I don't want to live to be 100, but I'm not sure I ought to be in Congress and be 100 years old. I think younger people need that avenue to come in and shake things up periodically. So I hope that people know that there are opportunities out there, and there are also good examples of people who've moved into the political world who've really done good things. And so just because you see a lot of the nastiness on TV doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of good and decent people as well.
Looks like we have one more question. Again, audience members, if you have one, put it in the question box. But this one is from Reed, who is another student here on the call. And Reed is saying that farming is a capital intensive industry to enter, and that you had mentioned that food production markets should be more accessible. Do you have any ideas of what can be done to lower barriers to entry, especially for young people who are looking to get more involved?
Well, there are some programs, beginning farmer programs, and the US government and the states both are involved in this. The private sector has kind of stayed out of this, but I get some sense that there's more and more interest in this. I tell you, there are a lot of the barriers you talk about capital intensive is high interest rates are just a gigantic barrier again in terms of getting into agriculture. High energy prices. You know, we've gone through actually kind of a wonderful period over the last several years where we've had low interest rates and low energy prices. But, you know, so, and by the way, because of that, you've seen more people getting into farming, particularly smaller sized farming, than you would have back in maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So those worry me. Those are going to be barriers against younger people getting into the business. But there's great diversity in agriculture now. You don't have to be just a wheat or a corn or a cotton or a rice or a soybean farmer. You can also do that and raise fruits and vegetables. The demand is going to grow and grow. If there's any one secret sauce to agriculture, it has to do with people's diets are changing, and their diets are moving to a much more diversified diet, and a diet that's a lot more based upon fresh produce and whole grains and lower fat products generally. And that's going to not only change agriculture, but that's going to allow diversification in agriculture, which is what we really need. The years of what I call monoculture agriculture, where you'd grow just a corn, soybean rotation, or in my part of the country, wheat only, those days are probably not going to last forever, because it's just the economics aren't very good at that. Diversification is one of the key things you'll probably see hopefully in the future of agriculture. And we all have to encourage that. The land grant colleges have to encourage that. The government has to encourage that, and the private sector. And another thing I would just close by saying, there's a lot of entrepreneurship and science in agriculture. That a lot of the new science, the genetic engineering. I'm a big fan of genetic engineering because I think it can save the world, basically. All of our modern drugs are genetically engineered. Nobody seems to mind taking insulin if they're diabetic because it's genetically engineered. But there's been controversy about food in this context. And I think that's going to change, particularly as we develop more traits that are positive to the environment and positive to nutritional health.
That's a wonderful, optimistic note to end on, Dan. I applaud your sentiments there with regard to the genetic direction that we're headed in. You've offered real challenges and insight for all of us, I think, to take heart with and grapple with, as well as you've illustrated some of the difficulties involved. So for my part, and Holly, certainly I think we speak together and saying thank you so much for being part of this program. You've added luster to it, and we wish you the very best as you go forward. And we'll be looking to you to help us set the direction in the future as well.
And I would say to both of you, thanks for inviting me, and to the students and others watching. If people want to contact me, I do read my emails. Don't overdo it, but it's glickmand@gmail.com. And so if anybody has a burning question or piece of question that maybe I can get some advice on, let me know.
Great, done. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you all. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Have a great evening.
All right, you too. Bye.
Bye-bye.